Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Encounter. Today we are going to talk on a very special, very interesting topic, the Flat Island. Flat Island, which is a popular place for Mauritians and tourists for leisure activities. However, today in this program we are going to consider the historical and the cultural aspect of this site, and we have today with us Dr. Krish Sita from Stanford University of California, who has carried out archaeological excavation on this site. Dr. Krish Sita, welcome. We have been working together at the Upper Vasigat Trust Fund under the aegis of Ministry of Arts and Cultural Heritage on different archaeological excavation in Mauritius, and you have been helping the government of Mauritius a lot in this field of research. As we all know, we have various disciplines of research, but you are specialized as an archaeologist. So please tell us about the history of the project, of the archaeological research that you are carrying out on Flat Island. Since the beginning, I think this is not the first time you've been excavating at the Flat Island.
Yes, thank you very much, Kieran. Happy to be on Encounters with you again and talk a little bit about Flat Island. So we actually started our investigations, our archaeological surveys in 2009. And I know Upper Vasigat had started from 2003 with the work that they were looking at, as this site was important within their mandate of studies and research on indenture specifically. And as you know, this then fits under the aegis of the Ministry of Arts and Culture. So we have a very strong relationship with Upper Vasigat, our project, Mauritian Archaeology and Cultural Heritage Project, really working directly with AGTF and with the government of Mauritius through the ministry. So we're very fortunate to have these relationships and to have these partnerships with you.
Tell us about your team. I mean, how do you devise the work? You've been working here for a number of years. We would like to know about your team and how you do the excavation.
We have a team of international colleagues. We also, as often as we can, we try to engage local students as well, or at least people who have of Mauritian origin, so that they can develop their skills in archaeology. We actually have a postdoctoral scholar who's Alessandra Chanchoisi, who was based with me at Stanford and at the University of Amsterdam, who had a very prestigious Marie Curie fellowship. So we could see that internationally the site was recognized through support of her project. We have colleagues from Sasha Chaval, who's coming from Slovenia, two of our senior colleagues, and then we have students as well, also coming internationally and from Mauritius, who have really been a great help. We're very fortunate as well to have had really good support from the forestry department. We have to seek permissions and their support when we're working on Flat Island. We also worked on Gabriel this year. So we've been fortunate, and finally we also had team members from Upper Vasigat themselves who are helping us with clearing the site and so on before our archaeological work.
Krish, we all know that Flat Island is a place where we go for sunbathing, where we go for leisure. But now that we are coming up with facts and artifacts about the quarantine station, I would like you to explain to us the concept of quarantine, isolation camps. Many of us knew about it only when COVID was there.
Right.
But it's interesting to know that since the 1850s, we had a quarantine station here. So tell us about the quarantine station and the disease because of which they were quarantined there.
Yeah, and it's an absolutely perfect question because we've all experienced the effects of epidemic disease, pandemic in this most recent context. I actually think it's worth mentioning our very good colleague, Tatiana Pietam. We were talking just recently, and he mentioned in fact that Ile Plate had actually been used for quarantine of enslaved people as early as 1815 to 17. So the mentality to push people off to these islets actually has much longer history. Quarantine started in Dubrovnik, which is another site that we work within that area too, in 1300s. So over the years, they've refined the process of quarantine. They've been more selective. Quarantine initially was about the control of disease around the movement of goods. It quickly became the control of disease around the movement of people. And by the time we're looking at the indentured diaspora and the relationships that we have with quarantine today on Flat Island, it was really about the control of people coming to Mauritius. If there were any ships that had signs of disease, they were prevented from docking at Port Louis and went straight to Flat Island. It's worth noting as well that we had quarantine stations at Île-aux-Tonneliers, at Île d'Ambre. Around the island of Mauritius, we had other quarantine stations, Île-aux-Bénitiers, but ultimately Flat Island became the most significant. And to sort of deepen that context and deepen that relationship between what was happening at Aprovasigat itself and what was taking place at Flat Island, we know that Aprovasigat was the place that the photographs were taken of the laborers. There was also photographs of laborers being taken on Flat Island. So the relationships are quite clear. The mention from Pietam's work where he was talking to you, where I mentioned his work on his suggestions about the quarantine of enslaved people. By the time the indentured diaspora is taking place and indentured laborers are being quarantined on Flat Island, there's a whole infrastructure in place that wasn't there before, including the buildings that you mentioned, the standing archaeology, and including the camps and so on.
Along with indentured immigrants, there were also slaves who were quarantined. Talk to us about the diseases because of which they were quarantined.
So I just make it clear, the enslaved people were quarantined much earlier. There wasn't, by this period, of course, there aren't enslaved people. We've transitioned to the period of indenture. The main disease was cholera, that the government the British administration was keen to prevent. There were other diseases at the time, of course. Malaria was a major influence, a major impact, yellow fever, tuberculosis, plague, but the main one was cholera. And so we're quite clear, in fact, from a map, and I should just mention, we're talking about Flat Island, but its sister island, Île-aux-Gabriel, was very much part of this cohesive quarantine establishment on both of these islands. And in fact, indeed, there's a map from 1857, I believe, which shows an area of Gabriel that's been used for burials. It's actually marked burial ground, specifically because of an epidemic. About 300 people were buried there, an epidemic of cholera.
Give us some information about the types of archaeology you're using for your research on this island.
Right, so at the moment, the main emphasis has been survey work. You had a very good point earlier. You mentioned the fact that we see these sites now mostly as leisure. In part, that's because we're restricted to where we can access the site, which has its benefits. But we see the pristine white beach, this crystal blue water. Right behind that, you start to see the buildings that we associate and what we describe as standing archaeology. So the vast majority of the island has been taken over by acacia. This is why we need the help of the Forestry Commission to open up the paths. The island itself was very well managed during the period that it was inscribed as a quarantine station. There were divisions between the areas where the Europeans were contained and the area where the indentured laborers were contained. And this was all very well delineated. One of the main emphasis has been, as you say, the different types of archaeology has focused on survey initially, opening up these paths, relocating, finding the standing archaeology. We believe that there's an area, a set of buildings that were actually used for distillation, although that's in question at the moment. We're still seeking further information on that. But there were certainly hospitals, there was a pharmacy, there's baggage stores. And so this form of archaeology is what we call standing archaeology. And frankly, what we see on Flat Island is phenomenal. The way the stonemasons of the time were working the basalt, it's quite unique. It's, in some cases, maybe a little bit more descriptive. It's more artistic than what we even see on mainland Mauritius. There's also buildings that have been, on their internal walls, they have been covered with with coral blocks. I find this is extremely rare. It's a lighter material, it's easier to work. I just want to make the point, a lot of material, well, virtually all material had to be bought from Mauritius. So you try to minimize weight, which is why they're using coral, although the main structures themselves are built of basalt. So it's very complex. The architectural features of the site are unique. In some cases, because of the process of abandonment, we've got really clear delimitations of the buildings themselves. They're in some cases, considering the age, we might even describe them as absolutely pristine in terms of the types of preservation that's there. pristine within an archaeological context. Obviously, we have a lot of work to do to bring them up to a standard where they can be visited. But we see the lintels, we see the remains of this historical wood that was used. So in that sense, that's really a phenomenal component of the site. And the sheer beauty of the buildings, the artistic components and the architecture is really fantastic. And so that's the standing archaeology, survey, standing archaeology. And then of course there's artifacts. So we've undertaken excavation. We found artifacts dated to the period, glass and so on, which we'll undertake analysis of. But the most important finds that we've had recovered only this year have been the human remains. So we finally have this wonderful, concrete, tangible evidence from the buildings. Now we have the tangible evidence of the humans who died as a consequence of the diseases that were affecting the populations at that time.
And where is that area where you found those graves? Is it very close to the ruins of the quarantine station, or is it on the beach? Where is it exactly?
There's an area that's actually, again, delimited on these maps. Corby was the one who produced these maps. And there's an area that it's called the Old Graves. And there's an area that's actually delimited as a cemetery. And of course, obviously, we've started our work there. Those are on the side which is close to, commonly known as Palisade. And if you go further up, you come to the lighthouse. And on the other side, you've got Pigeon Rock. So we're on the main island, away from what we maybe can think of as a public beach. And we found these inhumations there.
Okay, so you mean there is a cemetery there that used to be there?
Yep.
And now that in Mauritius, we are very much rooted in traditions, in culture, in beliefs. So as an archaeologist, when you do these excavations, especially when you find human bones, human remains, I mean, do you believe in some rituals? Do you believe in what we Mauritians believe?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. And obviously, you know, as a good local boy, I never allow excavations to start. My whole team accept this. They appreciate this, despite the fact they're from overseas. They appreciate the fact that we have our system.
Yes.
So we take a moment to offer some prayers, to light a candle, incense, kampf, offer some water. And there's permits to do the work, and then there's permissions to do the work. So we ask permissions of our ancestors who are buried there, and we make sure that we are Grand Jimun.
Yeah, you have
We've
the blessings.
consulted. Yes.
Yes.
We've had the blessings, we've had the consultation.
Yeah, the consent.
The consent. If only done through the heart, if not the mind.
Yeah.
But we do ask permissions.
Yeah.
We want to follow the traditions of our island. We want to make sure we're respectful of people who are buried there.
Yeah.
And this isn't just about ethics, it's about our own sense of respect for our ancestors and the burial of our ancestors, because we're all, in this context, we're all Mauritian, and we're using our traditions to explore the past in a way that we believe is ethical and sound, ethically correct to undertake our work.
So now when we're talking about ethics, about rituals, about respect, about blessings, what do you do with those human bones?
If I'm very frank, what we ask is that, can we reveal your story? What I ask is, can we reveal your story? So in order to do that, we want to take a full picture. We then we deploy our scientific tools. And we will undertake, with the permission of the government and with the authorization, permission of AGTF and their consent, to look at the DNA of the individuals. We look at isotope signatures. We know that these are diasporic communities. And isotopes tells us, if as a child you were drinking your water in Europe, in India, in Africa, we will know that. Because the signatures of isotopes from these parts of the world are different to the signatures of isotopes from Mauritius. So we know whether the person has migrated to this island. In this case, we're almost certain, but we follow up with the scientific evidence. And we also see their relationships in terms of whether they were born on the island, born on Mauritius, or of course, in this case, of course, they weren't born on Flat Island and they've migrated. So we can see where they've migrated from. The DNA also gives us very good information in terms of ethnic origin and ancestry. And we are working with a geogenetics lab in Copenhagen. So we have good collaborators in La Laguna in the Canary Islands who look at the ancient DNA for the demography, where do your ancestors come from? Where do these people actually come from? And we work with Copenhagen to look at the diseases that affected these populations. And so we'll be able to see whether the cholera is very difficult to find. We need to do that through another approach. But malaria and other diseases may be found within the body themselves. So we'll be able to understand what kinds of diseases were impacting these individuals. Of course, we have the more fundamental, what we might say traditional osteological analysis, teeth, bones, were there diseases that are evident on the bones themselves. We can see what kinds of injuries the individual had, what was their stature, their sex, etc., their age. So we really build a holistic picture of this individual's life ways through the bioarchaeology.
According to what you said, it seems that the research has now started. So tell us about your future plans, the future types of archaeology that you're going to use in this research.
Of course, we carry on with excavations. Now we effectively, we have to say, and in fact we were talking with the director of AGTF just about this point yesterday, now we effectively have what we'd like to call the smoking gun. We know that we have individuals buried here who died as a consequence of the diseases that were affecting this entire region, in fact. What we want to emphasize now is what's the broader ecological context. So just to sort of confirm, we carry on with the basic archaeological excavation, but we now want to situate that into the ecological context so that we can take a bioarchaeological view of the island. If we're fortunate enough, I undertake some dive surveys, very recreational diving, to see is there any possible. We know we work closely with the colleagues at the Department of the Continental Shelf and Jan van Arnhem, maritime archaeologist. We've consulted with him as to whether there's wrecks. They're producing a database of the wrecks. Can we at least see whether there's any evidence of these wrecks? What we want, in partnership with AGTF, is to integrate Gabriel, Île Plate, and the entire region, the ecosystem and the other types of archaeologies like maritime archaeology, into this holistic perspective on these islands, because the quarantine fitted within a broader context. Quarantine was happening because of land use changes, because of climatic changes that we were influencing within the landscape itself, with the movement, the diasporic movements of people. So we built a very complete, complex picture from these artifact types, from these forms of archaeology. So next step is to look at the environmental archaeology and to emphasize, if we can, whether there's any maritime archaeological heritage around the island that can help us understand where these people were actually moving from, etc., which ships were bringing the populations here.
Now tell us, what are the challenges that need to be addressed?
Well, the bigger challenges are actually not necessarily in regards to bringing the evidence together, because I hope I can say that the level of evidence, the level of significance of this site should mean that it has at least a good opportunity to move forward. The challenge is more in terms of preservation of the site. The challenge is more coming back to your original point. We see this site as a site of leisure. So Mauritians, tourists alike, are coming, enjoying the sun, enjoying the beauty of the island, without infrastructure in place for them to do the fundamentals of nature. So there are portions of the island that are being downgraded because there aren't toilets, etc., for visitors to use. Those are the types of things that first and foremost we need to put into place so that we pause. There's also a lot of waste that's being produced because tourists are coming. Let's consider everybody, visitors, let's put it as visitors are coming, plastic is being disposed, etc., There aren't sites to actually dispose of waste. So first and foremost, we need to sort of put a pause to this, provide some basic infrastructure. But then the larger challenges are to really consider this site as a site of ecotourism. So any tourism in the future has to be very sensitive to the nature of the site itself. It's a small islet. It needs to be preserved. We need to think about any actual tourism taking place needs to take into account that water, everything needs to be brought to the site. It needs to be a very low impact type of tourism. Again, these are discussions already being had with Apatavasigat. The mention of shipwrecks, for example, how can we diversify? So there are those individuals who want to come and look at just enjoy the natural beauty. There's those individuals that will come really within the context of ecotourism. There are those who will come within the context of heritage tourism. So we can have trails and so on to show them the archaeology, show them the standing buildings, these wonderful structures, the hospitals and so on. And then we hope perhaps there's even dive tourism. So people come and look at the rich fish life, but also wrecks if they exist around the island, if we can bring that all into a cohesive whole.
So now, Krish, you've explained to us very beautifully how Flat Island is today a combination of nature, ecology, but also culture, history, and all these are going to give an added value to this site, which Mauritians as well as tourists are going to even appreciate more.
Right, absolutely. And we were both at the recent consultative committee meeting at the municipality, where first and foremost we had the chairperson of Gat really laying out the plans for the buffer zone at the time, but also we had a chance to talk about Flat Island and expressing his will and desire that all stakeholders are involved. This isn't about preventing what needs to be prevented for the future and security of the country and for securing resources sustainably from these islets. Similarly, Minister Avinash Tilak spoke about this, really bringing in a cohesive framework to support a sustainable, low-impact effort to look at these islets, look at our cultural heritage in a way that both protects, preserves, but also allows an income for local population in a way that we need to develop. We're at the beginning of that. We've had at the very highest level, our own Prime Minister has spoken about environmental stewardship, ecological sustainability, and cultural heritage at recent meetings to sort of emphasize how it is our culture can be a wonderful resource. So at least on this count, I think we really need to commend our government and really support the efforts that they're making, support the fact that they are giving freedom to scientists and researchers to bring this evidence forward for the greater good, for the good of the public, and first and foremost for the good of Mauritius as a whole.
And I'm sure after this program, now that Mauritians and tourists who will go to Flat Island, they will see the island from a different eye. So in this respect, are you going to, protect that archaeological site where you're carrying out that service so that it is not being disturbed, something like that?
Well, I'll take it in a slightly different direction. I hope you have a wide audience. I hope your audience will consider some very small efforts. Please take away any waste that you bring. If you do decide to walk through into the paths, which are quite overgrown, be respectful of the buildings. Don't remove anything from the site. But ultimately, I'd really hope that people keep in mind this is probably the best preserved quarantine station, at least in this part of the Indian Ocean, if not the entire Indian Ocean.
Really?
We just haven't brought that evidence out yet. The coverage, the plant, the overgrowth, it's actually worked to protect the site in some ways. But this could be one of the best preserved, the most historically useful, one of the most complex quarantine stations, at least in this part of the world. And we should really do our best as a collective, visitors, scientists, researchers, government, the tour operators alike, because in the long term, this could be a wonderful resource, a wonderful insight into our past and into one of the more complex, less studied, but perhaps one of the most strongest connection to the modern population in terms of how the legacies of indenture are now being visualized in the modern day as well, when we're experiencing diseases cyclically as well.
Thank you very much, Krish, for coming today in this program and for giving us such insight on your research and for letting us Mauritians know more about our Flat Island.
It's always a pleasure, and thank you very much, Kieran, for allowing me to join you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our program. I hope you've enjoyed it. See you again. Thank you.